there is no better tribute to this culture than to sing it, to learn it, to experience it, and to remember the names. And we're lucky to have in our congregation somebody like Amanda who is so dedicated to Yiddish, to appreciate it deeply, not just as a language of jokes or of dirty words, which for many people that's what Yiddish is, but it's a deep and a profound culture. So in this night, I have a few things to say about this place that we are and about Yiddish. Some of you took a class I taught this past spring, an 8-session class about an introduction to Yiddish literature. I myself started studying Yiddish in the 1970s when I was a college student, and I took, to fulfill my foreign language requirement at Barnard College, Yiddish. Now that's a pretty ridiculous thing on some level, right? My father grew up speaking only Yiddish in his house in the Bronx until he went to kindergarten at age 5. And his mother, my grandmother, never really learned English. But so quickly, because I was to be the American child of the immigrant's child, I didn't learn Yiddish until I went to an Ivy League school, which I could fulfill its foreign language requirement by learning Yiddish. That's how crazy the story of American Jews can be. But in those years, I studied Yiddish very intensively as a college student, and I had one of the great Yiddishists of New York City as my teacher, who some of you know, Mordechai Schechter, and his family is really a pillar family of Yiddishists here in New York. And from him is how I learned about the Night of the Murdered Poets in 1952, because we studied Yiddish poetry. He was a bit of a iconoclast, but stories about Mordechai Schechter are for another day. This parsha, which we study this week when we're observing this commemoration, is the parsha of Shoftim, which literally means judges. And we talked about that in Psalms class this week. Shoftim are about judges. There's a lot in the parsha, but one of the aspects of the parsha has resulted in maybe the most famous verse in the entire Jewish Bible because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May her memory continue to bless us all. We know that in her chambers hung the saying, "Justice, justice shalt thou pursue." That's from the Parsha of Shoftim, which we read tomorrow. And the Parsha of Shoftim focuses on that a society cannot be just if the system of law and the execution of legal sentences is not just. There is simply no way, and that the focus of a chunk of the Parsha is on the importance of having judges who are not corrupt and a system which is not corrupt in order to have justice. And it goes into a great deal of detail. So it seems appropriate that tonight we observe this commemoration, which is in some ways the perfect example of when a legal system is not just and when the judges are corrupt. It was legal what it was done to the Jews of the former Soviet Union. It was legal because there was a legal system set up to do the things that it did. Sometimes legal isn't morally correct. And this parsha is all about the centrality in our tradition that legal must be aligned with that which is morally correct. That seems that it should be obvious, of course. And we in this country have been going through a lot these last few years, which have made us very anxious about that. That's for another drasha. But for tonight, we go into the story of August 12, 1952, with the lens of our tradition, which makes it so clear that law and morality must be aligned. So how did it arrive at a moment that this could happen? So many of us who are Ashkenazic Jews are, of course, descendants of Jews from what was, even before the former Soviet Union, Russia and Poland. So very quickly, and as many of you know, but to paint that picture, so before the Soviet Union in 1918, Jews lived under the empire, the rule of the Tsar. The Tsar was different depending on which Tsar it was, but it was not a system that was kind to Jews. And in the 1880s, Jews started leaving in droves as they could, and a debate erupted among the Jews of Eastern Europe how to respond to anti-Semitism, which was destroying the Jewish community economically and politically, and ultimately after 1881 with pogroms and violence. There were different answers we had in our community. One answer in the community that evolved was Zionism, was leaving to go to a Jewish state. And the Zionist answer in the time in Eastern Europe was that there could not be a resolution to anti-Semitism without a place of our own. That was one answer. Another answer was revolution, which was in the air in a big way. That the only way that we could deal with anti-Semitism was to overthrow the anti-Semitic Tsar and the anti-Semitic Tsarist feudal system and replace it. The revolutionaries were divided into many groups, but into two huge groups. One were the Yiddishists and believed that the revolution needed to be in Yiddish and needed to reflect Jewish values and needed to maintain Jewish identity, and those were the Bundists, for example. And the other stream of revolutionaries believed, no, that we could only get rid of anti-Semitism by overthrowing even all religion and to blending with the revolutionaries of the Mensheviks and then the Bolsheviks, and to create an ideal society in which every human being was equal. It was a beautiful dream. The third answer to anti-Semitism was to just leave and to come to either the United States or England or South Africa, but to get out of Eastern Europe and to find a way to a country in which Jews could live freely. In very, very large categories, those were some of the responses to anti-Semitism. So many became revolutionaries, not just Bundists who maintained a Jewish identity, but became part of the larger revolution which ultimately led to the 1918 Russian Revolution, which did outlaw religion, and in fact outlawed Hebrew. And for a brief time, Yiddish was expansive. And for some of those Jewish revolutionaries who were still there, they saw the possibility of a celebratory Jewish culture being allowed to live, albeit without Judaism, without religion, but Yiddish poetry and theater and publishing companies could exist. Stalin comes in the 1930s, and in his deep anti-Semitism and his anti-intellectualism, not only did the famine in the Ukraine kill millions, including many Jews, but started targeting the intellectuals, many of whom, of course, were Jews. Many Jews stayed in the former Soviet Union because they couldn't get out. They didn't all fit into those ideological categories. And they suffered, as did many. And many of the Jews who became communists became active in the Communist Party, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, seeing in the Soviet Union a society which was fighting racism, theoretically fighting economic injustice, and theoretically protecting Jews. But in the 1930s, as we heard, the purges were vicious. And not only millions of people died in the state really controlled drought and famine in the Ukraine in the 1930s, but thousands and thousands died in the purges, in the camps, in the various roundups that happened. And then World War II happened, and the Soviet Union was fighting Nazi Germany. Wow, that's complicated, right? Think about that. We don't often think about what that would mean for the Jews in the former Soviet Union. So now the Nazi Germany is the enemy, and in fact, many Jews from Western or Central Europe escaped into Russia to escape Nazi Germany. And during the years of the war itself, Stalin stopped the purges and stopped the persecution of Jews in the aggressive way of the 1930s. and in fact formed a committee that was led by one of the greatest of Jewish actors and directors, Shlomo Michoels, who became known as one of the greatest. He directed the Moscow State Jewish Theater, which was founded in 1920, right after the revolution. It was a great theater. He was well known as Tevye. He starred in the 1936 staging of Fiddler on the Roof of the Yiddish, Tevye der Milchiger, and he was Tevye and well known as a great actor, and he became chair of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. In 1940, so the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was used by the Soviet Union to spread far and wide that it was good in the Soviet Union for Jews, and they came to the United States in 1943 to get American Jews to support the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union war effort. There's much to be said about this. I'm going through this very quickly for context. However, the war ends in 1945, and Stalin's hatred of Jews emerges without the enemy of Nazi Germany, and he begins in 1946 and 1947 rounding up Jews. They were accused of espionage, of being anti-state, of all these different fabricated things. And then in 1948, Shlomo Michoels was killed in a hit-and-run accident, his body run over several times by a truck. We now know, in 1963, the Soviet Union acknowledged that it was an assassination by Stalin. This happened to set the stage for what was happening at the end of the 1940s. In 1952, several Kremlin doctors were arrested for allegedly threatening to kill senior politicians. That became known as the doctor's plot. Guess what? 99% of them Jews. Stalin instructed that all the arrested doctors to be tortured until they confessed. There was a famous trial in Czechoslovakia in 1952. 13 senior Communist Party members, 11 of whom were Jewish, were accused and convicted of being a part of a vast Zionist American conspiracy to subvert the Soviet Union. And then we know this story oh too well from tonight's service. All these intellectuals, poets, scientists, writers, actors, musicians, and artists were arrested. They were kept incommunicado. We don't know what it was like for them, and we don't know anything about the so-called trial. In 1981, Elie Wiesel's book, The Testament, was translated from French to English, and I read it then in 1981 or 1982. Elie Wiesel has this book called The Testament, which very few people know about. But because in that period of my life I was deeply engaged in Yiddish, I read it as soon as it was translated to English. He asked the following question: what would have happened if the greatest writers of our people, if we had some description of the trial and what was going on from their perspective? So he wrote a fictionalized account, fictionalized because all the records were destroyed by the Soviet Union, but he tried to imagine. And word is that Itzik Pfeffer, who was one of the greatest of poets, who was a member of the Communist Party, and he became, in his earlier years, up until the time he was arrested, he was quite an advocate for the Soviet Union, a huge voice for communism. Word is it that at the trial and while he was arrested and before he was executed, he recanted his communism and he regretted that he had rejected the Judaism of his father. So Elie Wiesel, and indulge me to let me read a little bit from this book, The Testament. He imagines a fictional character, but based on Pfeffer, but a fictional character. He doesn't try to pretend he knows what any individual said. It's a fictionalized version. Would write to his son, from the prison. Grisha, my son, I am interrupting my testament. The whole book is the testament, the last will and testament of the writer. I am interrupting my testament to write you this letter. When you read it, you will be old enough to understand it and me. But will you read it? Will you receive it? I fear not. Like all the writings of prisoners, it will rot in the secret archives. And yet, something in me tells me that a testament is never lost. Even if nobody reads it, its content is transmitted. The call of the dying will be here. If not today, then tomorrow. All our actions are inscribed in the great book of creation. That is the very essence of the noble tradition of Judaism, and I entrust it to you. I am writing to you now because I am about to die. When? I don't know. 1 month from now, perhaps 6? I cannot know. It's night, but I don't know whether the darkness is in myself or outside. The naked bulb blinds me. The jailer will soon open the peephole. I recognize his step. I'm not afraid of him. I try to imagine you in 5 or 10 years. What kind of man will you be when you reach my age? What will you know of the interrogations and the tortures that have haunted your father? I see you, my son, as I see my father. I see you both as in a dream, and the dream is real. My voice calls your and his, if only to tell me the world of its ugliness, even if only to cry out together for help, to mourn together the death of hope, and to sing together the death of death. I am your father, Grisha. It is my duty to give you instruction and counsel. Where can I draw them from? I haven't made such a success of my life that I can tell you, I have the right to tell you how to guide yours. I wonder whether people wish to be saved or are welcome. I don't know the answers that will have to be given to the grave. Fundamental questions. The individual facing the future, facing his fellow man, had no chance whatsoever of survival. All that remains, Grisha, is faith, God. As a source of questioning, I would gladly accept him, but what he requires is affirmation, and there I draw the line. And yet, my father and his father believed in God. I envy them. I tell you so you will know. I envy them their faith, I who have never envied anything. Perhaps you will read my poems someday. They are a kind of a spiritual biography. Songs, they're simply songs offered to my father who I've seen in a dream. My father, whose name you bear, knew something, but he is dead. That is why I can only say to you, remember that he knew what his son does not. I have tried. If I have time, I'll tell you how. Let me at least tell you this. Don't follow the path I took. It doesn't lead to truth. Truth for a Jew is to dwell among the people, the Jewish people. Link your destiny to that of your people. Otherwise, you'll surely reach an impasse. Not that I'm ashamed of having believed in the revolution. It did give hope to the hungry and to the persecuted masses. But seeing what this revolution has become, I no longer believe in it. I am going to die within a month, a year, and I should like to go on living with you and for you, to have you meet the characters who are sharing my weight in this cell of mine. I must tell you in my testament I did plead guilty. Yes, guilty, but not to what I take to be the meaning of the charge. On the contrary, guilty of not having lived as my father did. That, my son, is the irony. I lived as a communist, and I will die as a Jew. Itzhak Pfeffer, on whom this character is most likely based, came to the United States with others in 1943. And he met Paul Robeson during a Jewish anti-fascist committee event chaired by Albert Einstein, one of the largest pro-Soviet rallies ever held in the United States. After that rally, Paul Robeson and his wife befriended Pfeffer and Michoels. 6 years later, in 1949, this is an amazing story, there was a celebration of the birth of Alexander Pushkin. Robeson went to the Soviet Union, as he did several times, to sing there. In America, there had been the question, what's happened to Itzik Pfeffer? What's happened to the others, to Michoels? There was talk in intellectual circles that they had been killed, but nobody knew. There was absolute silence from the Soviet Union. So Robeson, who was treated as royalty by the Soviet Union, in a way to show up the racism of America, asked to see his old friend. He was told by the Soviets that his friend was on vacation in the Crimea. They didn't want to bring Pfeffer to see him because he was so emaciated. So the story is that they took Pfeffer to a hospital, fed him, got him fatted up, and while Robeson waited in Moscow for Pfeffer to come back from his vacation, Pfeffer was brought to him finally. The two men met in a room that was under surveillance, and both knew it. Pfeffer knew he could not speak freely, but Robeson reported that when he asked Pfeffer how he was, Pfeffer drew a finger across his throat and motioned with his eyes and his lips to his American comrade these words, "They're going to kill us," he said. "When you return to America, you must speak out and save us." During his concert, which was broadcast across the entire country, Robeson publicly paid tribute to Pfeffer, singing the Vilna partisan song Zog Nish Kein Mol in both Russian and Yiddish. So tonight, what we are doing is exactly what Elie Wiesel asks of us, to remember, to forgive those Jews who tried so hard to figure out and made choices. Some of them were communists, some of them were not. All of them were great artists. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. I'm struck by how that phrase of pursuing social justice could get so perverted by those communists who believed in a great dream, but it became so corrupted. The death of these Jewish artists and poets was one of the last things, ironically, that Stalin did. He died a year later in 1953, and the Soviet Union rehabilitated all of them a few years later. But their death, we remember, but most of all, we remember what they created. We remember their poetry, their art. Ich bin a Yid. I am a Jew. Itzik Pfeffer's poem. We now sing to music that brings his words, Ich bin a Yid. It's on page 8 of the program.